Gormenghast. Chapter 18. Like rooks hovering in a black cloud over their nests, a posse of professors in a whirl of gowns and a shuffling roofage of mortarboards flapped and sidled their individual way towards and eventually through a narrow opening in a flank of the master's hall. This opening was less like a doorway than a fissure, though the remains of a lintel were visible, and a few boards swung aimlessly near the head of the opening to show that there had once been a door. Faintly discernible on these upper boards were the words, "To the professorial quarters, strictly private," and above them some irreverent hand had sketched the lively outline of a stoat in gown and mortarboard. Whether or not the professors had ever noticed this drawing, it is certain that it held no interest for them today. It was enough for them to work their way through the fissure in the wall where the darkness engulfed them, one by one. Doorless as the opening was, yet there was no question about the professor's quarters being strictly private. What lay beyond that cleft in the heavy wall had been a secret for many generations, a secret known only to the succeeding staff, those hoary and impossible bands with whom, by ancient tradition, there was no interference. There had once been talk of progress by a young member of a bygone staff, but he had been instantly banished. It was for the professors to suffer no change. Try the scaling paint, the rusting pen nib, the sculpted desk lid with understanding and approval. They had by now, one and all, negotiated the narrow opening. Not a soul was left in the master's hall. It was as though no one had been there. A wasp zoomed across the empty floorboards with a roar, and then the silence filled the hall once again, as though with a substance. Where were the professors now? What were they doing? They were halfway along the third curve of a domed passageway which ended in a descending flight of steps, at the base of which stood an enormous turnstile. As the professors moved like a black, hydra-headed dragon with 100 flapping wings, it might have been noticed that for all the sinister quality of the monster's upper half, yet in its numerous legs there was a certain gaiety. The little legs of blackness almost twinkled, almost hopped. The great legs let fall their echoing feet in a jocular and carefree fashion as though they were smacking a friend on the back. And yet it was not wholly gay, this great composite dragon, for there were two of its feet which moved less happily than the others. They belonged to Belgrove. Delighted as he was to be the headmaster, yet the alteration which this was making in his way of life was beginning to gall him. And yet was there not something about him more imposing than before? Had he taken some kind of grip on himself? His face was stern and melancholy. He led his staff like a prophet to their quarters. Their quarters, for they were no longer his. With his accession to headmasterdom, he had forfeited his room above the professor's quadrangle, which he had occupied for 3/4 of his life. Alone among the professors, it was for him to turn back after he had escorted his staff a certain distance of the way, and to return alone to the headmaster's bedroom above the master's hall. It had been a difficult time for him since he first put on the zodiac gown of high office. Was he winning or losing his fight for authority? He longed for respect, but he loved indolence also. Time would tell whether the nobility of his august head could become the symbol of his leadership. To tread the corridors of Gormenghast, the acknowledged master of staff and pupil alike. He must be wise, stern, yet generous. He must be revered. That was it, revered. But did this mean he would be involved in extra work? Surely at his age. The excitement in the multiform legs of the dragon had only begun to operate since the professors had left the master's hall behind them, and with the hall their duties also. For their day in the classrooms of Gormenghast was over, And if there was one thing above others that the professors looked forward to, it was this thrill, this 5 o'clock thrill of returning to their quarters. They breathed in the secret air of their domain. Over their faces a series of private smiles began to play. They were nearing a world they understood, not with their brains, but with the dumb, happy, ancestral understanding of their marrow bones. The long evening was ahead. Not one ink-faced boy would they see for 15 hours. Taking deep breaths into its many lungs, the hydra-headed dragon approached the stone flight of steps. In its wake, along the domed ceiling of the long corridor, an impalpable serpent of exhaled pipe smoke hovered and coiled. An almost imperceptible widening of the corridor was now apparent. The professors became less cramped in their movements as the dragon began to come to bits. The widening of the corridor had become something quite unique, for their vista of wooden floorboards was spread before them until the walls, now about 40 feet apart, turned abruptly away on either side to flank the wide wooden terrace which overlooked the flight of stairs. Although this flight was exceptionally broad and the professors, as they descended, had plenty of space in which to indulge themselves, if the whim should take them, in a general loosening of their deportment, a more vigorous smacking of a fiercer twinkling of their feet. Yet at the base of the stairs there was, once again, a bottleneck, for although there was plenty of room on each side of the ancient turnstile for them to stream past and into the great crumbling chamber beyond, yet the custom was that the turnstile should be the only means of access to the chamber. Above the stone flight, the sloping roof was in so advanced a state of disintegration that a great deal of light found its way through the holes in the roof to lie in golden pools all over the great flight of stairs, with their low treads and wide terrace, like shelves of shallow stone. As with their difficult egress from the master's hall, the professors were now being held up at the great turnstile. But here it was a more leisurely affair. There was neither the scuffling nor the agitation. They were in their own realms again. Their apartments that surrounded the small quadrangle would be waiting for them. What did it matter if they waited a little longer than they could have wished? The long, bland, archaic, nostalgic, almond-smelling evening lay ahead of them, and then the long, sequestered night before the clanging bell aroused them, and a day of ink and thumb marks, cribbing and broken spectacles, flies and figures, coastlines, prepositions, isthmuses and essays, paper darts, test tubes, catapults, chemicals and prisms, dates, battles and tame white mice, and 100 half-formed, ingenious and quizzical faces with their chapped red ears that never listened, renewed itself. Deliberately, almost augustly, the gowned and mortarboarded figures followed one another through the great red turnstile and filed into the chamber beyond. But for the most part, the professors stood in groups or were seated on the lower steps of the stone flights where they waited to take their turn at the stile. They were in no hurry. Here and there a servant could be seen lying stretched at full length along one of the steps or shelves of the stone stairs. Here and there a group would be squatting like aboriginals upon their haunches, their gowns gathered about them. Some were in shadow, and very dark they looked, like bandits in a bad light. Some were silhouetted against the hazy golden swathes of the sunshafts, and some stood transfixed in the last rays as they streamed through the honeycombed roof. A small, muscular gentleman with a spade-shaped beard was balancing himself upside down and was working his way down the wide steps on his hands. His head was for the most part hidden, because his gown fell over and obliterated it, so that apart from balancing, he had to feel for the edge of each step with his hidden hands. But occasionally his head would appear out of the folds of his gown, and the beard would be seen for a quick moment, its harsh black spade a few inches from the ground. Of the few who watched him bemusedly, there were none who had not seen it all 100 times before. A long-limbed figure, with his knees drawn up to his blue jaw, which they supported, stared abstractedly at a group which stood out in silhouette against a swarm of golden motes. Had he been a little closer and a little less abstracted, he might have heard some very peculiar ejaculations. But he could see quite clearly that at the centre of this distant group, a short, precise figure was handing out to his colleagues what looked like small stiff pieces of paper. And so it was. The sprightly Perch Prism was dispensing the invitation cards, which he had received that same afternoon by special messenger. Irma and Alfred Prunesqualler hope to have the pleasure of blank company on blank, etc. One by one the invited parties were handed their invitations, and there was not a single professor who could withhold either a gasp or grunt of surprise or a twitch of the eyebrow. Some were so stupefied that they were forced to sit down on the steps for a short while until their pulse rate slackened. Shred and Shrivel tapped their teeth with the gilded edges of their cards and were already making guesses at the psychological implications. Fluke, his wide, lipless mouth disgorging endless formations of dense and cumulus smoke, was gradually allowing a giant grin to spread itself across his gaunt face. Flannel Cat was embarrassingly excited and was already trying to rub a thumb mark from the corner of his card, which he had every intention of framing. Belgrove had his great prophet's jaw hanging wide. There were 16 invitations altogether. The entire staff of the Leather Room had been invited. They had arrived, these invitation cards, at a time when Perch Prism had been the only master present in the common room, and he had taken over the responsibility of delivering them personally to the others. Suddenly, Opus Fluke's long leather mouth opened like a horse's, and a howl of insensitive laughter reverberated through the sun-blotched place. A score of mortarboards swivelled. "Really?" said the sharp, precise voice of Perch Prism. "Really, my dear Fluke? What a way to receive an invitation from a lady! Come, come!" But Fluke could hear nothing. The idea of being invited to a party by Irma Prunesqualler had somehow broken through to the most sensitized area of his diaphragm, and he yelled and yelled again until he was breathless. As he panted hoarsely to a standstill, he did not even look about him. He was still in his own world of amusement. But he did hold the invitation card up before his wet and pebbly eyes once more, only to open his wide mouth again in a fresh spasm. But there was no laughter left in him. Perch Prism's pug-baby features expressed a certain condescension, as though he understood how Mr. Fluke felt, but was nevertheless surprised and mildly irritated by the coarseness in his colleague's make-up. It was Perch Prism's saving grace that in spite of his old maidishness, his clipped and irritating academic delivery, and his general aura of omniscience, yet he had a strongly developed sense of the ridiculous and was often forced to laugh when his brain and pride wished otherwise. "And the headmaster?" he said, turning to the noble figure at his side, whose jaw still hung open like the mouth of a sepulchre. "What does he think, I wonder? What does our headmaster think about it all?" Belgrove came to with a start. He looked about him with the melancholy grandeur of a sick lion. Then he found his mouth was open, so he closed it gradually, for he would not have them think that he would hurry himself for anyone. He turned his vacant lion's eyes to Perch Prism, who stood there perkily looking up at him and tapping his shiny invitation card against his polished thumbnail. "My dear Perch Prism," said Belgrove, "why on earth should you be interested in my reaction to what is, after all, not a very extraordinary thing in my life? It is possible, you know," he continued laboriously, "it is just possible that when I was a younger man I received more invitations to various kinds of functions than you have ever received or can ever hope to receive during the course of your life." "But exactly," said Perch Prism. "And that is why we want his opinion. That is why our headmaster alone can help us. What could be more enlightening than to have it straight from the horse's mouth, For neatness's sake, he could not help wishing that he were addressing Opus Fluke, for Belgrove's mouth, though hardly hyperhuman, was nothing like a horse's. "Prism," he said, "compared with me, you are a young man. But you are not so young as to be ignorant of the elements of decent conduct. Be good enough in your puff-adder attitude to life to find room for one delicacy at least, and that is to address me, if you must, in a manner less calculated to offend. I will not be talked across. My staff must realize this from the outset. I will not be the third person singular. I am old, I admit it, but I am nevertheless here. Here! He roared, and standing on the self-same pavement with you, Master Prism. And I exist, by hell, in my full conversational and vocative rights. He coughed and shook his leonine head. Change your idiom, my young friend, or change your tense. And lend me a handkerchief to put over my head. These sunbeams are giving me a headache. Perch Prism produced a blue silk handkerchief at once and draped it over the peeved and noble head. Poor old Prickles, Belgrove, poor old Fangs, he mused, whispering the words into the old man's ears as he tied the corners of the blue handkerchief into little knots where it hung over the elder's head. It'll be just the thing for him, so it will. A wild party at the doctor's. Ha 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 ha. Belgrove opened his rather weak mouth and grinned. He could never keep his sham dignity up for long, but then he remembered his position again, and in a voice of sepulchral authority, Watch your step, sir, he said. You have twisted my tail for long enough. What a peculiar business this prune-squalor affair is, my dear Flannelcat, said Mr. Crust. I rather doubt whether I can afford to go. I wonder if you could possibly, lend me, But Flannelcat interrupted. They've asked me, too, he said, his invitation card shaking in his hand. It is a long time since our evenings were disturbed from the outside like this, interrupted Perch Prism. You gentlemen will have to brush yourselves up a bit. How long is it since you have seen a lady, Mr. Fluke? Not half long enough, said Opus Fluke, drawing noisily at his pipe. Never care for hens. Irritated me. May be wrong. Quite possible. That's another point. But for me, no. Spoil the day completely. But you will accept, of course, won't you, my dear fellow? Said Perch Prism, inclining his shiny round head to one side. Opus Fluke yawned, and then stretched himself before he replied. When is it, friend? He asked, as though it made any difference to him when his every evening was an identical yawn. Next Friday evening at 7 o'clock. RSVP it is, panted Flannelcat. If dear old bloody Belgrove goes, said Mr. Fluke, after a long pause, I couldn't stay away, not if I was paid. It'll be as good as a play to watch him. Belgrove bared his irregular teeth in a leonine snarl, and then he took out a small notebook, and with his eyes on Mr. Fluke, made a note. Approaching his taunter, Red ink, he whispered, and then began to laugh uncontrollably. Mr. Fluke was stupefied. Well, he said at last. It is far from well, Mr. Fluke, said Belgrove, recovering his composure, and it will not be well until you learn to speak to your headmaster like a gentleman. Said Shrivel to Shred. As for Prune-Squalor, it's a plain case of mirror madness, brought on by enlargement of the terror duct, but not altogether. Said Shred to Shrivel. I disagree. It is the doctor's shadow cast upon the shorn and naked soul of his sister, which shadow she takes to be destiny. And here I agree with you that the terror duct comes into play, for the length of her neck and the general frustrations have driven her subconscious into a general craving for males. A substitute, of course, for gollywogs. Said Shrivel to Shred. Perhaps we are both right in our different ways. He beamed at his friend. Let us leave it at that, shall we? We will know more when we see her. Ah, shut up, you bloody old woman, said Mulefire with a deadly scowl. Oh, come, La, said Cutflower. Let us be terribly gay, La. My, if it isn't getting chilly, La. Call me feverish. It was true, for looking up they found they were plunged in deep shade, the sun-blotch having moved on, and they saw also, as they raised their heads, that they were the last of the professors to be left on the stone steps. Motioning the others to follow, Belgrove led them through the red turnstile, where a moment or two after they had all passed through its creaking arms and into the dark and crumbling hall beyond. He turned and climbed the staircase alone, and eventually found himself in the master's hall once more. But the staff, after passing through the crumbling chamber, Indian filed its way along a peculiarly high and narrow passage, and at last, after descending yet another flight of stairs, this time of ancient walnut, they passed through a doorway on the far side of which lay their quadrangle. It was here, in the communal privacy of their quarters, that the excitement which they had felt mounting within them once they had passed out of the master's hall lessened, but another kind of excitement quickened. On reaching their quadrangle, they had digested the fact that they were free for another evening. The sense of escape had gone, but an even lighter sensation freed their hearts and feet. Their bowels felt like water. Great lumps arose in their throats. There were tears in the corners of their eyes. All about their quadrangle the pillars of the cloisters glowed, although they were in shadow, with the dark rose gold of the brick. Above the arches of the cloisters, a terrace of rose-coloured brickwork circumscribed the quadrangle at about 20 feet above the ground, and punctuating the wall at the rear of this high terrace were the doors of the professor's apartment. On each door, according to custom, the owner's name was added to the long list of former occupants. These names were carefully printed on the black wood of each door, their vertical columns of small and exact lettering all but filling the available space. The rooms themselves were small and uniform in shape, but were as various in character as their occupants. The first thing that the professors did on returning to their quarters was to go to their several rooms and change their black gowns of office for the dark red variety, issued for their evening hours. Their mortarboards were hung up behind their doors or sent skimming across their rooms to some convenient ledge or corner. The dog's-eared condition of most of their boards was due to this skimming. When thrown in the right way, out of doors and against a slight breeze, they could be made to climb into the air, the black cup uppermost, the tassels floating below like the black tails of donkeys. When 30 at a time soared at the sun above the quadrangle, then was a schoolboy's nightmare made palpable. Once in their wine-red gowns, it was the usual custom to step out of their rooms onto the terrace of rose-red brick, where, leaning on its balustrade, the professors would spend one of the pleasantest hours of the day, conversing or ruminating until the sound of the supper gong called them to the refectory. To the old quadman, sweeping the leaves from the mellow brickwork of the quadrangle floor, it was a sight that never failed to please, as, surrounded on every side by the glowing cloisters and above them by the long, wine-red line of the professors as they leaned with their elbows on the terraced wall, he shepherded the fluttering leaves together with his ragged broom. On this particular night, although not a single mortarboard was sent skimming, the staff became very flighty indeed towards the end of their evening meal in the long hall, when innumerable suggestions were propounded as to the inner reason for the prune squaller's invitations. The most fantastic of all was put forward by Cutflower, to wit, that Irma, in need of a husband, was turning to them as a possible source. At this suggestion, the crude opus fluke, in an excess of ribald mirth, crashed his great raw ham of a hand down on the long table so heavily as to cause a corps de ballet of knives, forks, and spoons to sail into the air, and for a pair of table legs to do the splits, so that the 9 professors at his table found the remains of their supper lying at every angle below the level of their knees. Those who were holding their glasses in their hands were happy enough, but for those whose wine was spilt among the debris, a moment or two of reflection was occasioned before they could regain the spirit of the evening. The idea that any one of them should get married seemed to them ludicrously funny. It was not that they felt themselves unworthy, far from it. It was that such a thing belonged to another world. But yes, indeed. Cutflower, you are right, said Shrivel at the first opportunity of making himself heard. Shred and I were saying much the same thing. Quite so, said Shred. In my case, said Shrivel, sublimation is simple enough, for what with the crags and eagles that find their way into every confounded dream I have, and I dream every night, not to speak of my automatic writing, which puts my absurd love for nature in its place. For in reading what I have written, as it were in a trance, I can see how foolish it is to give a thought to natural phenomena, which are, after all, nothing but an accretion of accidents. Where was I? It doesn't matter, said Perch Prism. The point is that we have been invited, that we shall be guests, and that above all, we shall do the right thing. Good grief, he said, looking about him at the faces of the staff. Oh, I wish I was going alone. A bell rang. The professors rose at once to their feet. A moment of traditional observance had arrived. Turning the long tables upside down, and there were 12 of them, they seated themselves one behind the other within the upturned tabletops as though they were boats and were about to oar their way into some fabulous ocean. For a moment there was a pause, and then the bell rang again. Before its echo had died in the long refectory, the 12 crews of the motionless flotilla had raised their voices in an obscure chant of former days when, presumably, it held some kind of significance. Tonight it was bayed forth into the half-light with a slow, knocking rhythm, but there was no disguising the boredom in their voices. They had intoned those lines night after night for as long as they had been professors, and it might well have been taken for a dirge, so empty were their voices. Hold fast to the lore of the last cold tome, where the earth of the truth lies thick on the page, and the loam of faith in the ink long fled. From the drone of the nib flows on through the breath of the bow reborn in a dawn of doom, where blooms the rose for the winds the child, for the tune the thrush, for the hush of song the corn for the scythe, and the thorn in wait for the heart till the last of the first depart, and the least of the past is dust, and the dust is lost. Hold fast!